Fairest by Gail Carson Levine, read by Rosemary Hungerford. Chapter 4. A few months after I discovered a losing, Mother and Father sent Rita to finishing school in the Kyrian town of Jen. Their notion was that a refined young woman would raise the tone of the inn. I understood. Why spend money on the ugly sister who stayed out of sight as much as possible? Why spend money on the ugly sister when no amount of finishing would alter her face? I felt hurt anyway. For a day and a half I hated my family, and everyone else, and myself most of all. Then I forgave them, but I didn't forgive myself. Arita didn't want to go. She wept as she packed. I was folding her hose. I sang, "Everything will be mildewed by the time you get there." She laughed and mopped her tears with a table napkin. She sang back, "I can't help it, I'll miss you. Nobody hugs the way you do." "You'll have too many new friends to miss anybody." I illused a succession of creatures from different parts of the room singing, "Have fun at finishing school," and "I'll be waiting for you," and "I love you." When I was 15, in the year of kitchen songs, in the month of April, King Oscaro announced his betrothal to a commoner from the Kyrian town of Bast. She was the daughter of a wealthy silversmith. Her name was Ivy in Aorthian. She was 19, and the king was 41. She'd never visited Aortha. The king had met her in Bast and had conducted his courtship there. She was a mystery, and would remain so until the wedding ceremony. We have a superstition. From betrothal to wedding, alter nothing, or the marriage will be cursed. Ivy wasn't to arrive at Antio Castle until the day before the wedding, and only her own servants from Bast would wait on her until she was wed. The nobility was scandalized that she was a commoner. Everyone but me was outraged by her youth and her foreignness. I felt a connection to the bride, another outsider. I thought of her often and spoke to her in my imagination, calling her Ivy. Not Queen Ivy as she would be, but Ivy, as if we were intimate friends. I was sure she had a voice beyond comparison and the fairest face I'd ever seen. Our village tailor had a cousin in Bast. We learned that Ivy was high-spirited. She had a temper and was a great flirt. The tailor said she was nothing extraordinary to look at, merely pretty. To me, merely and pretty were words that had nothing to do with each other. Pretty went with miraculously, and merely belonged in another paragraph entirely. But the most important question, the question on everyone's lips, went unanswered. The tailor's cousin didn't know what sort of voice the bride had. People in Kyria didn't break into song as we did. They had dances, balls, rather than sings. Aorthians have been singers from the earliest days of the kingdom. There is hardly a mediocre singer among us. Legend has it that our first king, King Odino, sang in his castle garden, and up sprang the first tree, the symbol of our kingdom. We believe singing has powers, to call forth a tree, to heal the sick, even to move the stars. Feeling moves us to song. Ideas can move us to song. Even long vowels may move us to song. A sentence like, "They may stay away today," is likely to be sung. Our ceremonies are conducted in song. We hold monthly sings, and we call sings for healing, for guidance, for settling arguments. Invitations to King Oscaro's wedding were sent to the nobility, to influential commoners, and to dignitaries from Kyria. The Duchess was invited, naturally, and she and Dame Ethely stopped at the feather bed on their way to the wedding. Dame Ethely had a cold, and a cold before a royal wedding is a near tragedy. One can't sing well with a cold. By morning, Dame Ethely was too ill to leave the inn. The Duchess told Father to call in a physician. Then she had me help her dress for her journey alone to the royal castle. "It is a trial to have a sickly companion," she said as I laced up her corset. Your Grace," I said diplomatically. "People will criticize me for traveling alone, but I don't keep a spare companion. No one does." She stepped into her farthingale. "Fetch my bodice," she sang. "Emily looks thin." "He's growing old, Your Grace." I held out the bodice. "Old? He's not old. Help me with the hooks." I began to do so. "Have you grown taller? I believe you surpassed Ethely." "Your skirt next, Your Grace?" She looked at me appraisingly. "Ethely's gowns would fit you." Occasionally, guests gave cast-off clothing to Mother. Dame Ethely's gowns were clownish. I demurred. "Thank you, but—" "Not a cape! To wear to the wedding!" "Whose wedding, Your Grace?" "Asa! I thought you were less thick-headed than most peasants." "I'm sorry," I gasped. The king's wedding? Your Grace, the king's wedding! I was terrified. There would be hundreds of strangers at the castle, hundreds of staring strangers who'd never encountered anyone as ugly as I was. But I wanted to see Ivy and the king and hear the singing. The singing at a royal wedding would be superb. And the Duchess said there would be a sing the night after the wedding as well. I'd hear every voice at court when they sang their solos. Mother and Father agreed to let me go. Indeed, they could hardly refuse the Duchess, and they were excited for me. Both of them, and my brothers as well, came out to the coach to send me off. Mother said I mustn't miss a single detail at the castle. Your sister will want to hear about the fashions, and I, she looked embarrassed, should like to hear about the hairstyles. Father said, Pay attention to how they run the palace, daughter. A castle is just a grand inn. Olo said, Sing loud, Asa. Let the king hear the featherbed's royal voice. I blushed. Yuri said, Don't fret. The way you sing, you could look worse than you do, and it wouldn't matter. Yuri, Mother said. I only meant... Hush, son. Father took 4 copper yorthies from his pocket. He sang, In a castle it's fine to have a purse that jingles. I was close to tears. Father was so kind. I'd never had so much as a tin yorthie before. I put the coins in my reticule. The footman handed the Duchess and me into the carriage. Mother waved her dish towel. The carriage door closed. The Duchess leaned back against the rockaged seat. It's a shame you're so... She trailed off, then resumed on Yari's theme. With your voice, if you were pretty, this trip might be the making of you. Chapter 5. As we rode in the carriage toward Antio Castle, the Duchess talked about cats, and I darned hose from the basket she handed me. We stopped for the night at an inn where both the beds and the porridge were lumpy. The innkeeper stared at me, as rude as any of the featherbed guests. In the morning, the road became steeper as we entered the foothills of the Ormalo mountain range. The slopes were dotted with boulders. Antio Castle was halfway up Mount Ormilio, the highest peak in the range. Gnome Caverns was somewhere beneath the mountains. I thought of the gnome Zom's prediction that I'd see him there, and that I'd be in danger. The prediction still seemed preposterous, but I was nearer to his home than I'd ever been. The carriage rounded a bend. There was the castle, popping out above us, the famed ivy even greener than I expected. I had been taught this castle had 16 towers, 5 square and 11 round. I felt them eyeing us, and I wondered if they were feeling friendly or hostile. If friendly, I hoped they wouldn't change their minds when they saw me up close. The carriage clattered across the drawbridge. I saw swans swimming in the moat, 4 white and 1 black. The carriage stopped. I heard birdsong and people singing. A footman in royal livery helped the Duchess step down. I jumped out after her. A tall 3-tree stood guard by the entrance. The Duchess went in, along with the coachman and 2 footmen, each bearing a trunk. I hugged my carpet-bag and followed behind. Inside the great hall, I stopped. The birdsong was louder here. I looked up. An exultation of larks flew overhead, beneath a ceiling that seemed as distant as the heavens. A troubadour near the doors played his lute and sang an Aorthean nonsense song. I stopped to listen and gawk. The wind took my hat, my jig-prancing favourite hat, with its lift feather whim and its whirling, adorling red heather. A juggler sang along while keeping 7 silver sticks in the air. I whirred at my cat, my faint speckled chocolate cat, my wish whether well. 4 courtiers watched the juggler. A peasant woman held a tray of chestnut candies and waited for customers. A falconer stood with a hooded bird strapped to its wrist. My eyes were drawn to the courtiers. 3 were women, slouching with their hips thrust forward. Mother would have thought their posture dreadful, but I found it worldly and appealing. I thrust my own hips out, and immediately felt ridiculous. I drew them back in. Arita was prettier than any of the women. I was uglier. Asa! I hurried after the Duchess, still gawking. My bedchamber was only slightly less grand than the Duchess's. My bedposts were mahogany, and the fringe on the canopy was 3 inches long. We had rugs at the featherbed, but ours were worn to the frayed thread. Here the rugs were new and springy, and the patterns were bright. I had 4 rugs. They were small, to be sure, but 4! I took off my travel-worn gown and draped the skirts over the dressing-table mirror. Then I went to the washstand, which was marble, so cool and smooth I had to stroke it. I poured water from the pitcher into the basin. A small sculpture stood in the soap dish. The sculpture was a green dragon, the size of a goose egg. Its mouth was open, but no carved flame spewed out. It was singing, not flaming. But where was the soap? Surely they washed with soap here. Perhaps the washstand had a lower shelf. I bent down. No shelf. Reading this, you know what a bumpkin I was. But the truth finally arrived. Smiling with delight, I picked up the dragon and scratched his scales. Soap flakes! The dragon was the soap! After I washed, I dressed in the ensemble of Dame Ethelie's that the Duchess had told me to wear. The underskirt was white silk embroidered with yellow roses. Lovely. I slipped it over my head. It settled on me like soft rain. That was the end of my pleasure. Dame Ethelie's hose was no better than the thick cotton stockings I'd left at home. The grey bodice was tied around my chest, although the shoulders were puffed. I struggled for air and wished I could breathe through my shoulders. Above the bodice, I tied on a starched white ruff. The stays jabbed into my neck. I stepped into a farthingale with hoops wide enough to encircle a haystack. Over the farthingale went a green underskirt, and then a pleated tan overskirt edged with fur. I expect you to wear both skirt and underskirt, the Duchess had said. I won't have you scantily clad. Scantily? It would take a carpenter a month to drill through the skirts and find my legs. I examined the headdress. The top part was stiff, rough-textured, and dark gray, resembling a roof shingle. A broad strip of white linen had been glued to it. I put the headpiece on, tied the linen behind my head, and pushed the ends out of the ruff. I was perspiring. I felt pinched here and pricked there, but I was dressed. I had to see how I looked. I whipped the skirts off the mirror. Then I tilted it to see as much of my reflection as possible. I looked and burst into tears. Chapter 6. I looked like a cottage, with my doughy face peeking out from under the roof. Hundreds of people were going to see me, and I looked even uglier than I truly was. I sat on the bed. I couldn't stop crying, although I knew the Duchess was waiting. She barged in. A cat rode on her shoulder. Until then I had never seen her laugh, but now she tittered. The titters turned to gales, then shrieks of laughter. "Not laughing at you!" she had the grace to gasp out. "The bonnet!" I couldn't laugh long. I waited her out. When she recovered, she allowed me to wear a different headdress. She told me she had something that would do. She left and returned, holding a grey cap with a single grey feather. "I never thought I'd wait on a servant," she said, handing it to me. The cap was better. The gown was still absurd, but I was no longer quite so conspicuous. After I helped her dress, we joined the crowd trooping through the castle corridors. I shortened my stride to the Duchess's mincing steps. Enough people stared at me to make me wish myself back in my room. I thought of my family. If I missed the wedding, so would they. We finally reached the Hall of Song, which I'd heard of for as long as I could remember. Oaken pillars supported an oaken ceiling. Each pillar was a wooden elongated singer whose lines and features had been softened by the centuries. Suspended from the ceiling, a wooden winged singer flew, her lips forming an O. A living lark perched on her left hand. Its song, clear and fine, was enhanced by the hall's legendary acoustics. The seats were arranged in a three-quarter circle, facing a stage. The Duchess's rank commanded a seat in the first row. I was on her right. Everyone was standing, and we stood too. A tiny man with bushy eyebrows stood between the stage and the seats. He held a baton, so I knew he must be Ciruelo, the Antio choirmaster, the most respected person in Ayortha after the king. A flutist waited next to Ciruelo, who raised his baton. The flutist began to play. Everyone hummed along with the flute. Under cover of the other voices, I illused, so that my humming came from the mouth of the wooden singer overhead. I was certain no one would hear me, but the choirmaster looked up. My heart almost flew out of my mouth. I stopped illusing. King Oscaro and Prince Ajori and a large black boarhound stepped through the wine velvet curtains at the back of the stage. I knew the king by his crown, and the prince by his dog. Every Aorthian knew about the prince and his faithful hound, Uchu. Prince Ajori was only 17, but he was taller than his uncle, the king. He had his uncle's rounded cheeks and narrow chin. He was handsome, very handsome, but for overlarge ears. I liked those ears. They were whimsical. They were charming. The prince's expression was solemn, but I detected a gleam in his eye. Then I saw Uchu lift a tidbit out of his hand. The hand moved to the pocket of his tunic, and the dog got another treat. The king was smiling, and I saw why everyone loved him. His smile was so sweet and kindly. King Oscaro was said to have the best heart in the kingdom. I believed it. He stepped to the edge of the stage while Prince Ajori and Uchu moved to the middle. A latecomer, a middle-aged woman wearing a gold tiara, crossed in front of me to reach her place 3 seats away. I wondered if she was Princess Eleni, the prince's mother, the king's sister. I sensed eyes on me. I glanced up, and it was the prince. I felt my blotchy blush begin. I saw myself in my mind's mirror. Blushing made me as garish as blood on snow. I felt the Duchess turn. I turned, too, as the bride entered the hall. The flutist missed a measure. Everyone's humming faltered. The Duchess sniffing. Merely pretty. She was ravishing. The tailor's cousin needed new eyes. My own eyes could barely take her in. Ivy was only a few inches shorter than I, but she was fragile, almost insubstantial. Her honey-colored hair shone as though a bit of sunlight was caught on each strand. Her skin seemed to glow from within like porcelain. Her bones, in her cheeks, her jaw, her wrists, were more finely shaped than the stem of a crystal goblet. She and I could have belonged to different species. She was ethereal, and I was base. I had been a fool to imagine the slightest connection between us. She advanced in measured steps as the ceremony required. Her expression was serious. Her gaze was on King Oscaro, except for a peek around the hall. She saw our astonishment and flashed a smile. Of triumph, I thought, and then became serious again. She joined the King Oscaro on the stage, and we took our seats. Sewell, the choir master, sang, King Oscaro. The whole wedding would be sung, of course. Yes, Aorta. King Oscaro's bass voice was full and rich. Ciruello sang, Maid Ivy. Ivy coughed. The flutist missed another measure. Ivy whispered, Yes, Aorta. Several people groaned. Everyone pitied her for losing her voice on her wedding day, but we felt fear as well as pity. This was unlucky. This boded ill. At home in Manta, a sore throat was cause enough to postpone a wedding, but a royal wedding, I suppose, with so many dignitaries attending, couldn't be postponed. Ciruello turned to face us. He sang, Aortiana. We sang, Yes, Aorta. After that, Ciruello sang that this was a marriage of three, King Oscaro, Ivy, and Aorta. The maiden who married the king also married the kingdom, and the kingdom married her. Ciruello likened king, queen, and country to the three-tree, which grew only in Aorta. The three-tree wasn't one tree, but three. The white oberco, the red almania, and the black bark rumbrul. Their trunks grew no more than an inch apart, and their roots and branches mingled. Ciruello began the three-tree song, also known as the Song of Aorta. Everyone joined in. The wind weaves through you, my three-tree. Your leaves rustle, swish, whisper, sigh. Iu shasho ititi akse upenso ini uhi olivo. Usaro ovra histati enesi ili efose. I'd sung the Song of Aorta hundreds of times, but never with the king. I wanted to remember everything. The smell of the courtier's perfume, the king's joy, the bride's beauty, and her whisper, the prince's ears, his dog, the birds trilling, the singing statues. The wind whips through you, my three-tree, your branches sway, whoosh, whistle, blow. Iu shashu koptu aksa upensu inni uhu lovo. Usare yivolki aha utisko uleho itiski. My oberco high and sweet, Aorta, my alma no mellow and light, Aorta, my brew dark and deep, Aorta. In the oberco alara e ushki, Aorta, in the alma no uti iski ishki, Aorta, in the umbro oscuro ikiashka, Aorta. The king sang his wedding song, declaring the reasons he loved his bride. She makes me laugh and cry. I reflect her glow and believe that I am glowing too. To please her for a minute pleases me a week. She has thunder and lightning, rage and joy. She breathes in the high notes and exhales the low. She wakes me up and makes me sing. Ivy smiled. She touched her throat and was silent. After the ceremony, the Duchess and I joined a receiving line in the corridor outside the Hall of Song. Perhaps 50 people were ahead of us. The line started to move. The Duchess stepped forward. I hung back. Asa! Feeling rising panic, I moved up. I shielded my face with my hand. I hadn't expected to meet the king and the queen and the prince. If I'd known, I'd thrown myself out of the carriage on the way here. Peeking in between my fingers, I saw Prince Ajori, with Uchu at his feet, greet the guests and announce their names. The Duchess and I moved up again. I tried to reason myself out of my fear. Everyone would be polite. The king and queen would be too caught up with each other to pay attention to me. The prince would be too occupied with announcing the guests. I concentrated on the royal couple and the prince, attempting to prepare myself. The king and queen's love for each other was unmistakable. She leaned into him and clung as tightly as real ivy. He beamed at her and looked prouder than an Aorthian lyrebird. As I watched, Ivy's expression turned impish. Oh, so adorably impish. She touched her husband's cheek and whispered in his ear. For a moment he looked discomfited. Then he exploded into laughter, and she looked vastly pleased with herself. Feeling I was intruding by watching them, I looked instead at the prince, who cocked his head in a doggy way when a guest spoke to him. He traded witticisms with the guests. He seemed to have a light heart and a clever tongue. When a guest reached the king, he held her hand or put her arm around his shoulder. Ivy whispered, "Thank you," to each one. I couldn't hear, but I could read her lips. She smiled the same smile each time, too, brilliant, but automatic and lacking warmth, nothing like the melting smile she bestowed on her husband. I grew desperate. Only a dozen people were ahead of us. Most guests spoke their congratulations, but sung same verse of their own composition. One guest had a flawless high soprano. She wasn't as beautiful as the queen, but she was a beauty, dark-skinned with a face of gentle curves. She sang, "Congratulations, may your voices mingle long and late." And the Duchess whispered, "We expected the king to marry Lady Arona, who would have been a much better match, and we wouldn't have had such an inauspicious wedding either if Arona had been the bride." "Not necessarily. Lady Arona might have had a sore throat too." "Long and late, may your double lives spin a single melody." Ivy's smile faded. She smoothed a stray lock of gray hair behind the king's ear. She was demonstrating her claim to him. She was jealous. "Of joy forever, of joy forever, of joy forever." King Oscaro patted Ivy's hand. Now I was jealous. The gesture was so loving. No one would ever pat my hand that way. He spoke loud enough for me to hear. "Thank you, Lady Arona. Your good wishes can hardly fail to come true." He paused and then burst out, "Arona, is my Ivy not a wonder?" He turned to Ivy. "My dear, you are always lovely, but tonight you outshine the stars." Ivy looked smug. Lady Arona seemed to take the king's remarks with good grace. She curtsied and started off, down the corridor. 4 people now separated the Duchess and me from the prince. "Your Grace," I said. "Yes." "I forgot—" "What could I have forgotten?" "I forgot my handkerchief. I'd better fetch it all—" "Nonsense! I'm not going to wait. You needn't— How dare you interrupt me?" 2 people remained before us. "Your Grace, I can't stay. Let me go. I must go." She understood. "Don't be silly. I didn't bring a companion in order to be alone." She stepped closer to the prince. I followed her. I was uglier than a hydra. I was as big as the corridor. There was nothing to look at but me. Prince Ajori announced the Duchess. I stood frozen. She stepped forward. "Congratulations, sire. Congratulations, your majesty. I hope you'll be very happy." I didn't move. I stared at the floor. My blush was as red as raw meat. The Duchess said, "Asa, the king is waiting."